Martin Scorsese's film Hugo tells the story of an orphan boy attempting to find answers regarding his father's death and direction and meaning for his own living. Hugo's father was a watchmaker, and the images of springs and gears and sprockets are metaphors in his quest for purpose. Hugo imagines the whole world is one big machine and says to his friend Isabel, "Machines never come with any extra parts, you know. They always come with the exact amount they need. So I figured if the entire world was one big machine, I couldn't be an extra part. I had to be here for some reason." Yet Hugo realises that many people are completely missing any sense of purposeful existence and have abandoned attempting to make a meaningful contribution to the world. Hugo laments quite profoundly, I think. Everything has a purpose, even machines. Clocks tell you the time, trains take you places. They do what they're meant to do. Maybe that's why broken machines make me so sad. They can't do what they're meant to do. Maybe it's the same with people. If you lose your purpose, it's like you're broken. It's this sense of brokenness which leads Hugo to discover that his particular purpose, much like his father's, is to fix things. But it isn't clocks and watches that he fixes, but helping people recover their sense of purposeful life, significance, which becomes his life's work. In other words, Hugo's vocation is helping others find their vocations, and so bringing all the parts around him into harmony. This is our aim as pastors too through this preaching series. We want to be like little Hugos. We believe all human beings at the core of their being have a longing for a life that has meaning and significance. People want to use their time and energy to make a difference, to make things better as the reason for their productivity and effort. We believe this is how God has made us, to use our abilities to work and bring His goodness and order to everything around us, and especially the people that we love, so that all may flourish. We've been made to do something. This doing emerges out of our being, who we are as God's children. But something is out of harmony and needs fixing. We believe that those called to Jesus have been remade with this purpose renewed, to work in partnership with God as energized by His Spirit in restoring and redeeming and reconciling all things under His good governance, so that the new creation of His kingdom is experienced on earth now as it is in heaven in a glorious harmony, the first fruits of what will surely come. We've been helping one another to be listening to our longing. Having a satisfactory response to that longing is what Viktor Frankl called man's search for meaning. What we do, our work, matters to us. We want it to matter to others, to count for something. In this series, we've consistently wanted to talk about work as far more than just our jobs. But we don't want to neglect talking about our career, because for many of us, this will take up a substantial and influential part of our life and energy. Our employment is very important to most of us. A Barna research study showed that more than half of all adults say it's essential to their happiness to have a job where they can make an impact. And yet almost half of all adults feel anxious about making the wrong career choice. Many people who are Christians have the additional agony of frequently worrying about God's will for their life, fearing they might choose wrongly or miss out on what He wants them to do. This can lead to anxiety, paralysis, and a lack of vocational commitment and contentment. So, what should we do? What should we choose to do for work, both paid employment and other productive activity? And how does it all fit together in harmony alongside rest and play? Answering those questions is the work before the work. They are questions we ask and answer repeatedly throughout our life. This work before the work is a basic of Christian discipleship. When people wonder, what am I here for? The church should be ready to help them find their answer, which directs their day-to-day living. because this lived answer forms our response to the gospel message that Jesus is Lord. This is what Paul does with the people in the church at Ephesus, as he gets them listening carefully to God's calling. I would encourage you to read for yourself all of Ephesians chapter 4 and reflect upon it as God's instruction to direct you in your situation. As you do so, you'll hear in verses 1 to 6 how God has called you to himself, and that this calling you have received when you were called includes a call to live in particular ways alongside others who have also responded to that calling. We are now part of the people of God, the ecclesia, the church, the called out ones. From verse 7 onwards, you'll hear how God has given you as a gift to this called community, and by grace given you abilities and gifts to use to serve him and others. These are not given for yourself, but you are graced with these abilities and gifted as a person so that we can all mature and grow and be equipped by God for works of service, as Paul says in verse 12. We don't do this work or service in isolation, but in unity. As in our diversity, each part does its work, as he writes in verse 16. Living this way, Paul says in verse 17, enables us to escape living futile lives. Instead, as he says in verses 20 to 24, we learn a new way of life, which is taught in accordance with the truth that is in Jesus. Jesus brings us into a state of new creation with the whole new self, which now lives just as he lived, with God and for God. It is living in the glorious harmony of being and doing, in true righteousness or justice doing, and in holiness, which is being set apart for his purposes. This is living for God's kingdom as we work for his good glory, which is the eternal purpose we were created and recreated for. As Paul had written earlier in Ephesians at chapter 2 and verse 10, for we are God's handiwork, created in Christ Jesus to do good works, which God prepared in advance for us to do. This is our calling, our vocation. Vocation comes from a Latin word meaning calling. We could trace its history and see why it's wrongly come to be used only of employment, but biblically it embraces all we are called to be and do in Christ. Paul Stevens explains this really helpfully, I think. Calling establishes our identity by showing whose we are. Calling means that our lives are shaped by our relationship with God and his wonderful purpose for our lives. All the actions to which God calls us in the world are sacred. The whole of our lives, not just work life, is given form and direction. Leisure, rest, relationships, service, and of course work. We are called to a life, not just to a job or ministry. Since this call comes to the whole people of God and not merely to an elite leadership, it means that all are called into full-time ministry. There is no part-time option available. Calling saves us from inventing the meaning of our lives by enlisting us in God's grand work of transforming the world. So we have many callings, multiple vocations, which comprise our calling to Christ and flow from that relationship. These callings overlap and are responded to simultaneously. They change according to opportunities, needs, stages of life, health factors, our development, changing interests. Housework is work. Using our resources is work. Relationships are work. Church ministry is work. Study and education are work, and not just preparation for work. Employment is work. And moving into retirement from employment is moving into another stage of work. But which things should we do, and how do they fit together? Now, the topic of how God guides us is a big one, but I want to suggest briefly that aligning yourself with God's will is not a specific pathway for you to work out, which God maps out in advance and for which you must be continually looking around for signposts to direct you along the way. The search for a blueprint or a script for our life, for God to tell us each step along the way, I think is an abdication of responsibility and a sign of immaturity. It's covering over our freedom to make informed choices with a cloak of pious delusion. Instead, we seek God-directed wisdom as a way of being and doing, so that we choose life. This is how we know and prove His will. Many people want simple answers on a plate, but they rarely exist. There are no shortcuts of insider knowledge to be found in our pathway of sanctification. Rather, we have a dynamic relationship into which we grow as God transforms us by His Spirit. It requires constant, ongoing listening and responding. This makes us pilgrims on adventure and companions in following the way. It is the hidden Christ who calls, wrote Bonhoeffer. The call as such is ambiguous. What counts is not the call, but the one who calls. Calling is less like a plan and more like a posture. It is discipleship. Vocation does not begin with a search, but in a heart of devotion. It does not begin in discovering the will of God, but discerning the will of God, which is always loving the neighbour. Which is why I can give you some guidelines which are general enough for all of us, but which are of specific relevance to our individual lives at each stage, if we're willing to consider them. So, as you consider particular work opportunities, whether it's paid employment or anything else, listen to how these aspects might be calling you into that activity or away from it. We should choose work which is sustaining. Now, that's an obvious thing to say. If you can't make a living, you don't live long, and you'll serve nobody but the worms. When I consider all my working, I ask myself, will my choices sustain life? Mine and those I carry responsibility for, such as my children, but also other members of my family. When I was younger, I considered being a potter. Now that's a tough gig to make a living by. That doesn't rule it out, but if I'd gone along that route, I might have had to consider the riskiness of that choice and perhaps ways I could sustain myself with other work besides pottery. These days, every second teenage boy I meet wants to be a professional gamer. I think that's an even tougher gig than pottery, especially when there are so many kids wanting to do it, 10 on each street. I'll leave aside the question of whether anyone at all should ever be able to make a living by playing games. But it raises an important global perspective. At its most basic, we work to sustain life. The riches and privileges and stability of the Western world afford us untold opportunity, which for some young adults leads to a paralysis of choice when they're wrongly told, you can do anything. For billions of others in our world, they don't dream of such choices, but must work every waking hour in drudgery just to feed themselves and little else. The real first world problem is not our career anxiety, but our apathy in not responding to injustice. When you come to the work of voting, if the ideology of the political party you endorse does not take seriously and respond to emphatically the structural injustices of this world and its systems, but puts everything down to individual responsibility and endeavour, know that it's fallen short of the biblical vision of the world. Both the First Testament and the New Testament insist that there are forces, powers, authorities, rulers, principalities, and the systemic impacts of sin, which are far greater than isolated individual choices which shape life in this bent world. Such poverty robs people of choice and the chance to flourish. It robs the world of what they might otherwise contribute. How many brilliant scientists and artists and medics and teachers perish because of starvation and war? And all of humanity is poorer for that. Surely part of our work, like that of Hugo, and far more importantly like that of Jesus, is to address such injustice and bring right order and harmony for all. We should not rest until our first world problem is a global problem. This takes us to issues of sustainability and of our environment, but they'll have to be left for another day. But it does lead naturally to the second key reason we work, which informs our choices. This is doing work which enables sharing. As Paul put it in our reading in Ephesians 4:28, anyone who has been stealing must steal no longer, but must work, doing something useful with their hands, that they may have something to share with those in need. We work directly in our working, but we also work with the resources we earn from our working. Some of you are able to work in jobs which are richly rewarded, and so having been given much, from you much will be expected. This is not a burden, but a delight. It's a privilege, for you can do so much good. You can help so many others in need. You have power to help the powerless. One of the worst things about being poor is the limitation it places upon you in helping others as generously as you might. Yet don't we often see that, just like the Macedonian Christians that Paul writes about in 2 Corinthians 8, it's often those who are extremely poor who are the richest in generosity. The god Mammon does not control them as he does for those of us who have him as a larger presence in our lives. How are you sharing what you have by your work and with what your work brings you? Others of you have been able to secure work for long enough to secure life without needing to keep on working to earn an income, so you are now free to work in other areas which don't pay. We retire from a career, but we never retire from working for God. For biblically, work is not about securing things for ourselves, but for serving. Paul's emphasis in this chapter, in highlighting to the Ephesians how God has gifted them, is not to make them feel self-important, but to remind them of their ability and obligation to serve others. That is the lifestyle they are called to in all their workings. God has lavished us with gifts, passions, and opportunities which we steward for the common good as he works through us. Paul explains that to the Corinthians, writing in 1 Corinthians chapter 12. There are different kinds of working, but in all of them and in everyone, it is the same God at work. Now to each one, the manifestation of the Spirit is given for the common good. Peter says the same thing in 1 Peter 4:10. Each of you should use whatever gift you have received to serve others as faithful stewards of God's grace in its various forms. We are free in our choices to do that, but with freedom comes responsibility and accountability. As he reminds the Galatians in 5:13, you, my brothers and sisters, were called to be free, but do not use your freedom to indulge the flesh yourself. Rather, serve one another humbly in love. We have freedom in our work choices, if I can use that loaded phrase, and how we employ these gifts. But it's not a freedom from constraints as much as it is a freedom for self-giving to others. We serve working for the needs of others before our own. That's our freedom. So how do you exercise your freedom when it comes to work? Is freedom to serve directing what you choose to do? Who are you serving and how are you serving them? This also, I think, directs us what we choose to do, but also how we do our work. We serve and impact others by how we behave in what we do to others as we work at relationships and even in the most mundane of actions, such as how we speak to each other, seeking the benefit of others rather than reacting out of self-interest. As Paul puts it so wonderfully and practically as he lands in Ephesians 4:29, do not let any unwholesome talk come out of your mouths, but only what is helpful for building others up according to their needs, that it may benefit those who listen. This recognises that all work is about shaping others, shaping our world, being shaped ourselves. It's in our doing, our working, that the new self is formed, working out or outworking our salvation, as Steve explained last week. So a simple question to ask yourself about what you are doing is this: how will this work form me? Will it make me more or less like Jesus? This Christoformity is the aim of discipleship, looking like Jesus as if he was you in your being and doing. This, I think, rules out some careers as out of bounds. Work which is criminal, selling illicit drugs, but also work which is manipulative or exploits the weakness in others or degrades the environment or impoverishes others as a consequence. That which supports conflict or destroys family. I think that rules out anything to do with gambling, or that which corrupts ourself, like sex work. This also says that some work will be better for you than other work because it will stretch you and challenge you and call upon you to rise to the occasion. Some of us don't want to work like that and retreat into what I think we must call laziness. So perhaps ask yourself, will this work give me challenge, or will it just be a doddle? If you are looking only for comfort and ease, what does that suggest to you about yourself? This shaping aspect of work is what I think Brother Lawrence meant when he spoke about finding or practicing the presence of God amongst the washing up sink of pots and pans in the monastic kitchen. As he served others in this mundane and therefore challenging task, seeing how this work was serving others shaped him and enabled him to know God in himself, transforming him and using him as he grew in love for others. As we work in these ways, we will be living in God's mission, working by showing. We will be affirming the announcement proclaimed by Jesus that the kingdom of God has come. It's here now through his presence in the world, first in his human flesh and now in his body, the church. The kingdom of God has come near, bringing about justice, peace, flourishing, beauty, creativity, helping people, restoring, arranging, forgiving, reconciling, renewing. So we ask, what is there in all my working which brings order and justice and flourishing? What is my good work in light of the resurrection life I now possess, revealing that the new creation has begun and that Jesus is indeed Lord now, ruling with all authority? Again, hearing this call to action guides us in what work we choose. Does my work make a difference to the world in realizing the Lordship of Christ over it to restore and recreate? Is my work part of a just or unjust system? Some workplaces, some individual companies, as well as some jobs or ways of working are not consistent with love and justice, or at least raise difficult questions about how someone in a certain career negotiates the system of their workplace. You might reflect on things like participation in the armed forces, or approaches in advertising or marketing, types of insurance that get sold, ways of generating income through the stock exchange, parts of the legal profession and how it's practiced. Each of these types of work all have obvious and significant challenges to negotiate. I'm not saying they're out, but we need to think about them. But even in work that serves an obvious good like medicine or teaching, still have significant ethical and moral dimensions which require choices and change. Some products and some industries produce goods and services of questionable value and do so at great cost to our environment or others, or are done in ways which exploit their workers, keeping prices down so that profits for owners and shareholders are up. For some of us, our work might be a calling to transform such work. We might be those who can help change the systems and structures. I spoke the other day to a lawyer who's getting out of law because of the adversarial nature of the courtroom. I understand that. But why not first try and change the system? Why not advocate and educate for a different practice? It does not have to be that way. And it isn't in some legal systems around the world where they take a different approach. The kingdom of God is revolutionary and transformative. It's not about fitting into corrupt systems which impoverish life, with the Christian aspect being limited to being as ethical as you can be and evangelizing to your colleagues about some sort of private faith. And so, the way of work is to be seen in our individual lives. It is through this that we are signifying. We are signifying what is important in life according to God's values. So many people choose their career based upon ideas of personal fulfillment, status and financial security. Work in the limited sphere of employment becomes the driver in how they live. But this fails to consider the impact of this job choice on their ability to work fruitfully in other spheres of life, such as in family or church or in broader society, so that our job derails or overtakes everything else, and this job actually becomes anti-vocational and unbalanced. As Steve said last week, it's not so much a work-life balance, but a rhythm of work, rest and play. We all need time to invest in healthy relationships. We want to be a decent self, not an exhausted one. There are big cultural issues here, I think, about the nature of family life, for example. What's expected of someone in providing? Is good parenting providing material resources and opportunities that you secure by earning money and getting your kids into a good school, whatever that is? Or is it affection and involvement in their daily life? Is it time or is it things? Is love shown by providing or by intimacy? That's another time to discuss that issue. What we must agree upon, I think, is that for Christians responding to the call of Jesus, there is no compartmentalizing in life. Jesus is Lord of every minute and every action for his people. We've already killed off that notion of a sacred-secular divide as unbiblical, but we can still be tempted to put things in different compartments or of a hierarchy of relevance, what's more important compared to something else. In their book, Spiritual Formation in Emerging Adults, David Setron and Chris Kiesling write, equating vocation with a paid occupation can overvalue this sphere, producing tendencies toward workaholism. In addition, such a perspective has the tendency to divest other activities of their meaning and importance in the life of the kingdom. When work is viewed as the exclusive venue of vocation, in other words, other spheres are automatically ascribed leisure status and treated accordingly, the home becomes a place to rest and enjoy the fruits of one's labour with fellow family members. The church becomes a place to be refreshed or recharged and to enjoy fellowship with other like-minded families. The community becomes a domain in which we consume goods, services and entertainment as an antidote to the stresses and strains of paid occupations. It's a consumer annex to this private sphere. Sadly, I think their observation rings true for many of us, not just young people. Instead, all spheres are places for working for the kingdom. So there is the bigger picture, which applies to us all. But probably you still feel I haven't said much about us as individuals. That's good guidance for all of us in our similarities, but what do I do with myself because we are all unique? How do each of us respond to be the individual self which God is calling us to be? Reminded of Martin Buber recalling that ancient Hasidic tale of Rabbi Zushya. When he was an old man, Zushya said, "In the coming world they will not ask me, 'Why were you not Moses?' They will ask me, 'Why were you not Zushya?'" That is God's question to us as well. We are not expected to be who we are not, but who we are. But who are we? What should an authentic John be? In the work before the work, we are listening to God. As an individual, we are also listening to our own lives. Parker Palmer, in Let Your Life Speak, wrote, "Before I can tell my life what I want to do with it, I must listen to my life telling me who I am." Let me give you a simple tool to do that. This Venn diagram on the screen asks you to think about 3 overlapping questions in no particular order. What could you do based upon your abilities and talents? For me, I could never be a private contractor because I'm too much of a soft touch and would end up working for nothing. I could never be a miner because even bending over to tie up my shoes stretches me to the limits of my suppleness. But there are a few things which I have some ability in. You might have an aptitude or manner or a strong aspect of your character that means you are suited for a particular task or profession, whereas others are not. Secondly, what would you do? If you could do anything, What are you passionate about? What gets you excited or daydreaming or thinking? What do you enjoy? What feels satisfying when you've finished it and why? What groups of people or issues do you care about and which draw you in? And thirdly, what should you do as you consider what is in front of you? Where do you think you can make a difference or meet a need or do something new? What doors for service are open now? What needs to be done that you've got some capacity to act upon? What is your responsibility because certain people or situations are entrusted to you? So the aim is to have all three spheres present simultaneously. Where they overlap, well, that may well be a place of calling for you. This is describing the optimum, and it's not always possible, but it is the ideal. Where there are only two of these things and not the third simultaneously, there is a danger, at least as an option for long-term working. Where there is no could, then there is delusion. If I was aiming to be a movie star or a pro golfer, I would be deluding myself, out of touch with reality, because I could never do those things. When there is no would, work becomes dry routine. Most jobs have boring bits, but if the whole thing matters little to me, even if I'm good at it and I make a good living from it, then perhaps I need to change. When there is no should, there is hollowness. This is pointless work. I wonder about those creative people who are paid well to make little models to put in fast food meals or at supermarket checkouts to entice children who bring along with them their parents and their parents' wallets. Or those great salespeople getting rich by selling useless or dodgy products. What a waste of talent. Now just some caveats with this little picture. We don't want to limit our future based upon our past. It's very possible for you to grow into something new that you've never tried. And we should not use a lack of ability or passion as an excuse not to meet needs when the occasion demands it. Be alert to the fact that true passions can at times be buried underneath a pile of imposed desires. I've spoken with many people who chose their careers because their parents told them what they had to do. Rarely was this based upon an understanding of their child, but was more about what the parent felt would provide a secure and respectable career. And we must get over that misshapen idea that enjoying work and pursuing what you desire is somehow sinful. Desire is not wrong, it's part of love. Rather, we need to desire what is good and desire it passionately. This applies to desiring God and desiring good work. So listen to yourself. What impact is your work having on your well-being, your emotional and physical and spiritual health, your relationships, your relationship with God? Are these being negatively impacted by this work? Then either you need to grow into learning how to manage this new context, in which case this is the hard work of transforming your being through your doing, or it says you don't belong in that area. Perhaps you should move. But just because something is a passion doesn't mean the work will be easy. A passion might call us into a place of hardship or pain or conflict with others, or require us to grow and develop while struggling with a sense of failure and incompetence, or the challenges of the circumstances and rhythms of life working against us in this work sphere. Some of us have been told that we grow most when we are out of our depth and have to rely upon God. Now there's clearly truth that His strength can be seen in our weakness, and certainly relying upon Him in all things rather than upon ourselves develops that relationship of trust and gratefulness. But I think that notion can go too far, with us thinking that we have to do something we are bad at to fix our weakness and avoid pride. For long-term working, we thrive best and enjoy our work more when we do something we are naturally good at, which God has enabled us to become competent in. To deny this is to deny His creation and providence. Your talents or abilities should be your primary focus. But don't assume you must have it all together before you can do anything. Most of us grow into competence by doing, by making mistakes, learning and correcting until we become good at something with that unconscious competence, where we don't have to think about how to do something, we just do it instinctively. Study after study demonstrates that this is how we thrive and are most productive in our work. Life experiences obviously shape us in these things, which is why it's good to try lots of different things as we grow, whether that's part-time employment or travelling or mixing with different types of people or doing tasks simply because we're asked to do them as a favour to someone. Finding good work means having a go at many things. If you live your life and you're waiting and hoping for this amazing passion to emerge, it's very unlikely to happen. Good research shows that passion emerges from trying and doing stuff, reflecting on it and learning about yourself. It's a minority of people who are crystal clear at the beginning of their choices. Let me finish with an example of how listening and acting on all of these directional factors played out at one point in my life. Although, if I'm honest, I was not at all conscious that this is what was happening within me at the time. I started going to church when I was about 16. About a year later, at Christmas time, a woman in our church who worked with, or at a place that was then called the Spastic Centre, organised for a whole group of us to go there and sing Christmas carols. She simply called me up and gave me the address and the time and told me to be there, and so I went along. I can't sing to save my life, and as a teenager I was even more useless at chit-chat than I am now. So making conversation with someone who could not speak back was challenging for me, to put it mildly. But I went, and despite significant anxiety and awkwardness at the start, by the end of the night I'd had quite a good time. I went along the next year. But what I didn't know then, but what I can see in retrospect, is how that single choice to respond to this calling, which I would regard as consistent with the biblical calling of God's people to care for others, and that calling came to me through that woman, how that impacted the course of my life. That one night led to rich friendships, especially with one man who lived at the centre, who I would end up spending time with several days a week for more than a decade. It led to ministry within my church to others who had different disabilities, as it taught me about the joy of their company. It showed me the difference I could make to someone else. It led to a career working in several different jobs with people of diverse disability. It changed me as a person, transforming my character and giving me skills that I would never have formed if I'd not done that work. This experience led me to realise that it's often easier to look back and recognise calling rather than to see it as a map directing you in how you live each step of life before you take it. So my posture in life became, always have a go if you can. Don't say no to an opportunity. You never know where it might lead. Don't let fear or anxiety make the decision for you. But what about you? I wonder what God is saying to you now about what you are doing and your productive time and energy. What work He is encouraging you to go into more deeply or to move on from and change to. What opportunities could you try? What could you do differently where you are now if you know that this is where God has called you to be? Maybe talk about it with someone else. Let's help one another to do the work before the work. And remember, God is at work within us to will and to do His good pleasure.